So now if I play a note while moving this, which is set to CC1, or just the mod wheel on your MIDI controller, you can hear. See, in my last video, I said you can add that sparkle of magic onto your MIDI to give it a more human performance. And to do that, you have to use a combination of articulations and dynamics. And in MIDI, those are controlled by modulation and automation. Now don't worry, there's quite a few big words there, but let's look through them one by one, and I'm sure you'll pick it up. Now before we start, you have to understand what a sample instrument or sample library actually is. So a sampled instrument is literally when you record an instrument for playback via MIDI in a computer, and a bunch of these together is called a sample library. Now when you record an instrument, there's lots of ways that it can be played. So take this humble melodica for example. I can play a note on it, yes, but do I play a long note? Do I play it softly or loudly? Do I play a short note? Do I play a short note with an accented start? Do I play a long note with an accented start? Or do I do something like flutter tongue effect? So these techniques typically get sorted into three categories: long notes, short notes, and special instrument techniques or effects. So those are the kinds of things like I can play flutter tongue on this, but I can't play flutter tongue on this because I play this with my hands and not my mouth. And then with each articulation, you can play each one of those with a different dynamic. But let's start with articulations. So let's start by opening up Logic Pro Sampler. Now the easiest way to explain articulations I find is with the strings. So let's go to App Presets and then Orchestral Strings. And if you can see here, we have legato, which is a long articulation, which is bowing back and forward on the violin. We have pizzicato and staccato, which are both short articulations. Staccato is playing short notes with the bow, and pizzicato is when they pluck the strings with their fingers. So tremolos and trills, I put in that third category of the special effects or the instrument specific techniques. So let's load up just the first sound and let's play in a short melody. So now that's in, the first thing that I recommend doing, and what is such a good habit to get into, is to tidy up the MIDI, as in make sure it's snapped to the grid and that the notes are as long as you want them to be, and that kind of thing. So when you're splitting out your articulations or dragging this MIDI up and down to different articulations, that it's going to be in time and you're not cutting notes and all that kind of stuff. It's such a good habit to get into. So the first thing to do is quantize, as in let's put the start of the notes actually on the start of the bar. So you can go through it and manually do this, or alternatively, you can select them all, pressing Command and A, and then finding your nearest subdivision, select that, and it will quantize it to that. And if that's not right, you can then manually correct it, or you can select different sections and quantize those, and then select other bits and quantize those. So once that's quantized, if you were to right click a MIDI note, you get all these different options. And if you can see here, there is one that says trim note end to selected note with an 8 ticks gap. Now ignore the ticks gap, it just means it's not going to go quite to the end, but that's absolutely fine. So if I select these all and then right click, I can then do that and it trims to end. Now if you don't want each note to be as long as it is, make sure you go back through and edit it to the length that you want. So now that's all tidied, we have this. Now let's apply a few different articulations to this melody and see if we can get a bit more of a performance out of it. Now the quickest way to do this is if you select the track and bring up the instrument, and then you want to click on this little link icon here. So all this does is means that when you select a track, you're going to see the instrument applied to that track and not something else. So that if you're changing the sound, you're definitely changing the sound on that track and not something else. So now, pressing Command and D, you can duplicate the track, and because we have the link icon, we are now on this track. We can then tab across one and we can get the next articulation, and just repeat until all the different articulations are there. So now let's split this up across the different articulations. So these first few notes, I think they're fine being as they are. So let's split the track here, and these next ones, I think those will be better sounding in the staccato. I think this will sound better being a tremolo. They can be legato again. They can be staccato again. And this one here should be a trill. So now it's all the same melody, but it's split across the different articulations, and we get this. So much better. But can you hear how some of the notes are louder than others? This is where we can use dynamics to give a more consistent and more expressive performance. So dynamics, in its most basic sense, is how loud or quiet something is. So you can have a quiet layer of dynamics or a loud layer of dynamics. And to access those different dynamic layers, we use two methods: velocity or modulation. Let's start with velocity. So the easiest way to show this is using short notes. So if I program in a series of short notes, can you see on the left it says velocity and then this little slider? And it goes from 127 down to 1. So MIDI works from numbers 1 to 127 for every parameter that it has. 1 is always the lowest parameter and 127 is always the highest parameter. So for dynamics, 1 is going to be the quietest dynamic, with 127 being the loudest dynamic. So Logic can show you this with a quick colour reference. So if I take this first note here and I tell the dynamic to be 1, you can see that it goes this purpley colour. And at the end here, it is 127, and it is this red colour. Now if I draw a straight line in between all of these in the note velocity, you can see we get this nice colour that goes from these bluey purpley colours all the way up to red, and it sounds like this. Now I know that this instrument has two dynamic layers, one for soft and one for loud. And you can see that if we come to the sampler itself and go to mappings, can you see here, there's two different samples showing. This first one goes from 0 to 110, and this last one goes from 111 to 127. So I know that if I put one short note in and have it between 0 and 110, and another one in that is above 110, we're going to hear two different volume samples. So Logic Sampler itself is quite clever in that it will turn the volume up and down of these samples to give it more of a smooth curve, so you don't hear the jump from one sample to another. So with this knowledge, we can edit the colours of these and the numbers to give accents on specific notes. So I think these ones should be a bit more accented than these. I simply select and just drag down the velocities. So what about long notes? Well, these two work in exactly the same way. So if we look at the sampler for the long notes, we can see we have three dynamic layers. One for soft, one for medium, and one for loud. So the quietest layer goes from 0 to 70, the second layer goes from 71 to 110, and the third layer goes from 111 to 127. So in theory, I could take this first note and make it really loud, second note, make it really quiet, and the third note somewhere in the middle. Now that's all well and good, but on the real instrument, I could start playing a note softly, get louder, and then get it soft again, all in a single note. And we're triggering different notes, you can't do that. So to do this in MIDI, you have to use controller messages, otherwise known as modulation. So in mine or other people's videos, you might have seen us using something like this. Typically, all these are used for is for sending CC or controller change messages into Logic. So this one here, for example, I have set for modulation, and when it's down, it's sending the message 0, and when it's up the top, it's sending the message 127. So if I want to blend naturally from quiet to loud, I'll turn the fader up, and from loud to quiet, I turn it down. And the reason we typically use these is it allows to give a bit more expression and dynamic as you're playing, to give more of a human touch. But if you haven't got something like this, it doesn't really matter. You can draw it all in with your mouse. And to be honest, I use a combination of both. So most sample libraries come ready to be controlled via something like this, or have a method to easily turn it on. Annoyingly, Logic Sampler doesn't, but you can do it, and this is how. Now you don't have to understand how all this works, but just to explain very quickly, the zone is the individual sample and how you want it to play. The mapping is where it's mapped to the keyboard. The modulators are ways to affect the sound. The mod matrix is ways of controlling how you're affecting the sound. And synth just gives you those basic controls that you would find on most sample instruments. So if we click on mod matrix and we change velocity to mod wheel, this is saying that we want the sample select to be controlled by the mod wheel, which is standard, is set to CC1. So now if I play a note while moving this, which is set to CC1, or just the mod wheel on your MIDI controller, you can hear it is switching between the different samples. But let's go one step further. Now if we go to mapping and then groups, and we want to set the crossfade zone of all of these to about 25. And what this is doing is applying a crossfade between those different samples. So now if I do that again, you can hear that it blends between the samples smoothly. Now the last thing to do is to make sure that it doesn't react to velocity at all. And to do this, if we go to modulators, and in ENV, which stands for envelope 1, you want to turn this velocity here down to 0. Now the last thing you can do to give it that extra little touch of realism is set up another controller called CC11, which is expression. Expression is basically just volume control. But when you use expression and modulation together, you can control the volume as you get louder and quieter and give an even more realistic performance. So on here I have set modulation and expression. So if I play a single note, you don't hear anything until I turn up the expression or the volume. And now when I move these together, you get a far more exaggerated quiet to loud. Much more realistic. So now let's put some of this information into our melody and see if we can get even more performance out of it. So these little lines here show that you've inputted some kind of controller message. And if you double click on this and then press this button here, or A, you have here, you can see the note velocities, so you can adjust them if you wanted to. But if we toggle down on this, you can see modulation and expression. And again, using your pencil tool, you can easily shape this to whatever you want it to be. Now the common term for all of these kinds of lines is called automation. It can be used in both audio and in MIDI, and it's just a generic term meaning that you're changing some kind of parameter along the length of the timeline. So putting all of this together, you now should be able to play or record in some kind of melody, and using these different techniques on modulation, dynamics and articulation, make it sound even more human. Like and subscribe and all that kind of stuff, and I'll see you in the next one. Because I play this with my hands and not my mouth. Well, no, not worth it.